Hello, everyone. Attorney Yuri Birg here, and we have Professor Farkas from DePaul University with us today. Welcome.
Thank you, Yuri. I'm very, very happy to share some ideas.
And we'd like to discuss Professor Farkas's experience as a professor and also his experience working with the State Department. We will discuss Ukraine, many other countries in the former Soviet bloc, and maybe talk about where we think things are going and how this relates to today's immigration law. So, Professor Farkas, I know you do a lot of our expert opinions on asylum matters, including Ukraine, including some other countries such as Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan and Russia and others. And when we have asylum claims, oftentimes we ask Professor Farkas to give us an opinion, an expert opinion on the country conditions and on the client's personal statement and how the country conditions relate to the personal statement.
Yeah, I take this task very seriously because I think one of the things that happens is that there's a need to have a sensitive insight into the nature of the society from which the claimants are coming. And it takes a lot of experience, I think, to gauge that. I've been at it 55 years. I've been teaching at university. I'm still active. From the very beginning in the 1960s, the focus was on the socialist systems in East Europe, the communist systems. And of course, when they changed, I continued to try to gauge the nature of what was happening in those places. I think if there's any singular thing that I bring to the table, it's the fact that I've been to many of the towns and villages, as well as the major cities. And it's always been a major effort on my part to understand the nature of life in those communities and the nature of people's plight in those communities, so that when Yuri gets a representation of some experience that people have had, I feel particularly able to say something about the accuracy of those representations.
Professor Farkas, tell us a little bit about your experience with the State Department and Ukraine specifically, and the projects you've been involved in with Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, the State Department and the Fulbright Foundation have an arrangement where they identify particular people as senior experts, senior specialists. It's a special combination program where the State Department provides the funding. And these special, typically older scholars with a lot of experience have an opportunity to engage in special projects. The ones that I've been dealing with go back to, in Ukraine at least, go back to about 2013-14, right after Maidan, and focused on two things, really. One was the nature of what's called corruption in those societies, and the nature of the intolerance or prejudices that are common in those societies. And both of those factors are particularly useful in assessing the validity of the kinds of claims that asylum seekers tend to make.
So to clarify, there are basically 5 ways you can get asylum. There's 5 grounds. There's political persecution, there's persecution based on religion, based on ethnicity, based on citizenship, for lack of a better description, or a social group. A social group can be various types of people, but that includes certain business people, certain LGBT community members. For example, for Eastern Europe and some Central Asian countries, it also includes women who may have been kidnapped or forced to marry, etc. So it is our job as lawyers, and also we seek professional help from an expert witness, to identify country conditions in your country, how they relate to your personal statement, and explain to the court and to the judge of how that works together and why your claim is legitimate. Now, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I was going to just add that in my 5 decades plus of traveling and studying those societies, I've encountered every one of those 5 prejudices.
Right. So, but tell us a little bit more about your work with the State Department and what kind of projects would you be involved in with Ukraine specifically?
Well, Back right after Maidan, of course, there was an immense amount of change in the system, and the political system was in disarray, to be modest about how to represent it. But the concern was, can the new system create a trajectory in which it addressed corruption? And I think there's two ways to look at it. Corruption. I don't want to be too involved in it, but there's the elite corruption in which people are taking advantage of the system for their own purpose and to enrich themselves. And then there's a kind of a textured corruption that runs through the entire society. Those are the behaviors that my project was addressed to or charged to deal with. And we were making some progress until I was in Ukraine just a month before the war broke out, before the Russians invaded. And we were making some progress, but it's patently clear to me today that the war set back any progress that could be made. To change public attitudes and psychology, cultural psychology, takes generations. And we were modest about our objectives and thought we were making some headway. But at the moment, I'd say the situation was a bit worse than it's been in my experience. The little progress we were making has been turned on its head. And with the interest among the Ukrainians to try to create unity, an awful lot of these abuses and prejudices tend to have resurfaced.
Yeah. Now, Professor Farkas and I have been working together probably since maybe 2019, approximately maybe, on asylum matters where we use expert witnesses. His work with the State Department, particularly for issues involving Ukraine, but also his knowledge of the entire Eastern European and Central Asian landscape is invaluable for us, and we're very happy to have his expertise. Tell us a little bit about your teaching, the subjects you teach, how the student body may have changed over the years.
Yeah, it's been quite an adventure, actually, a professional adventure, if you will. I've been teaching since 1969, actually, and it's a lot of major transitions. What I teach about are the transitions that took place after socialism in places like, well, all of the places that were part of the old Soviet Union, all of the stands, the new countries, Belarus, Russia, Ukraine, all of the East European countries, from Poland all the way down to Albania. And of course, some of these kind of egregious prejudices bubbled up again in the Balkan Wars in the 1990s, in Bosnia and such places. I was actually charged at one point in time with creating a draft constitution for the new country of Bosnia-Herzegovina, which has never been adopted. It's a country that still is without a constitution. My courses involve teaching about East Europe. I teach a course in Russian-American relations, Russian politics, Ukrainian politics, the politics of the Balkans. And it keeps my hand in. The number of students in Chicago, in the Chicago area, is immense, with backgrounds in those areas. And I try to do a very responsible, balanced job of explaining what the reality is. And I can't imagine how someone with less life experience in those countries could represent it accurately.
And of course, you traveled through many of these countries. Tell us a little bit about what you think is happening in Central Asia, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, etc. The balance of power, the relationships with the U.S. and Russia.
Yeah, let's be clear. That's a part of the world, the so-called stands, the more eastern part of what used to be the Soviet Union. Those new countries were left in a shockingly unprepared way to deal with their own political publics and the politics involved. Those are some of the most uneven political places in the world at large, and they are, I think, without a game plan, without a format, without without a vision for what it is they want to become. And the collapse of the Soviet Union left them without much foundation. The abuses in those countries, especially around some of the 2 or 3 of the 5 bases that Yuri mentioned a bit earlier, are really incredibly egregious. There's some well, let's call it uber intolerance, which is what you very often find in that part of the world.
All right. Professor Farkas, thank you for joining us. Pleasure. Hope to see you soon.
As always.